On a bright morning in the 1950s, on a stone terrace on the Grand Canal in Venice, an aging woman sat in enormous sunglasses with a string of small dogs at her feet. Behind her, facing the water, stood a bronze horseman, arms flung wide, anatomically and deliberately complete. On certain holy days when the Patriarch of Venice passed by boat, she would reach up and quietly take part of the statue off and hide it in a drawer. I have gone back to that terrace more often than I can explain. The woman was Peggy Guggenheim. The name on the door was one of the most famous in America, attached to a copper and silver fortune that had once been among the largest in the country. And yet the woman on that terrace, surrounded by her paintings and her dogs, had received almost none of it. She had a fraction of what her cousins held, and she had built, on that fraction, something none of them ever managed. Consider a few things before we go any further. A father who walked away from one of the great American fortunes, lost most of his own money, and then died on the Titanic in full evening dress, saying he was ready to go down like a gentleman. A daughter who inherited a few $100,000 while her cousins were managing hundreds of millions. A woman who set out to buy one painting a day in Paris as the German army advanced, and who bought a Leger the morning Hitler invaded Norway. A collection of some of the greatest modern art ever made, put together in a few years for about $40,000, and estimated today to be worth, by some accounts, well over $1 billion. The Louvre, asked to hide her paintings from the Germans, decided they were not worth the trouble of saving. A small gallery in New York, run by a woman the museum world treated as an amateur, where the entire New York School of Painting first found a wall to hang on. And the branch of the family that dismissed her, that was said to have tried to buy up every copy of her memoir to protect the family name, now owns her collection, runs it, and lives partly off the judgment of the relative it never respected. Every one of those things is documented. They are also not the strangest part of the story. This is the story of the Guggenheim who was left out of the fortune. It is also the story of how being left out was the making of her, and how the collection she built on almost nothing now belongs to the very family that shut her out. I want to start at the palace on the canal, because the palace is where she ended, and because the way it ended tells you most of what you need to know about the way she lived. Before we go on, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these and rewards the work that goes into them, and it is free. Chapter 1. The Unfinished Palace. The palace sits low on the Grand Canal, in the Dorsoduro district, on a bend in the water where most of the buildings rise 3 and 4 stories into the Venetian light. This one does not. It is a single story of white stone, broad and flat, stopping where its upper floors should begin. It was designed in the middle of the 1700s by an architect named Lorenzo Boschetti for a Venetian family called the Venier, and only the ground floor was ever built. The grand upper stories that were drawn on the plans never rose. For 2 centuries, the Venetians had a nickname for the squat white building on the bend of the canal. They called it the Unfinished Palace. Before Peggy, it had passed through other striking women, a Marchesa who kept exotic animals there early in the century, and an English society beauty after her. That is the building Peggy Guggenheim bought in 1949, reportedly for $60,000, and lived in for the last 30 years of her life. It suited her, a woman the family had never quite finished accepting. Living out her years in the palace, the city had never quite finished building. She filled it with the most advanced art of the century. On the walls were Picasso and Pollock, Ernst and Mondrian, Brancusi and Giacometti. In the garden she put modern sculpture and a small cemetery for her dogs, and eventually herself. The dogs were a real and serious part of her life, as many as 14 of them at a time. Not the 100 of the legend, but enough that the city knew her as the woman with the little dogs in the gondola. When they died, she buried them in a corner of the garden under a plaque that called them her beloved babies and listed their names one by one, from the first to the last. She arranged, when her own time came, to be laid to rest beside them in that same corner, the woman and her dogs together, in the garden of the palace the city never finished. On the walls inside hung the movements of the century in order, the Cubists, the Surrealists, the first Americans who would break the whole thing open. On the terrace facing the water, she placed the Bronze Horseman, a work by the Italian sculptor Marino Marini, a naked rider on a horse with his arms spread wide, and his body, by the artist's choice and hers, in a state of open excitement. By her own account, she had the most prominent part of the statue cast separately, so that it could be unscrewed, and on holy days when the nuns and the patriarch went past on the water, she took it off and put it in a drawer. I find that detail almost too perfect to be true, and yet it is hers, told in her own memoir. It holds the whole woman in a single gesture. The seriousness about the art, sitting beneath genuine Picassos and Pollocks. The refusal to be respectable. The private joke at the expense of every institution that had ever looked down on her. All of it in one bronze figure on a canal, taken apart and reassembled at her pleasure. And yet the terrace keeps a secret from the people who stand on it. This palace, and everything in it, now belongs to a foundation that carries her uncle's name. The most visited place in Venice after the Doge's palace is the home of the Guggenheim. The Guggenheims did not want. Close to 400,000 people a year walk through it, past the Pollocks and the Picassos she chose, which makes it the most visited place in Venice after the Doge's palace itself. Almost none of them know that the woman who chose everything on the walls was, by the standards of her own family, the poor relation, the one who had been left out. There is a way of reading the unfinished palace that explains the whole woman. A building that was begun with grand intentions and never given its upper floors, bought by a woman who carried a grand name and was never given the fortune that should have come with it. Both of them incomplete by the standards of what they were supposed to be, and both of them, in truth, far more interesting for it. To understand how a Guggenheim ended up with so little of the Guggenheim money, and how that turned out to be the luckiest thing that ever happened to her, you have to go back about 100 years to a peddler with a pack on his back and 7 sons. Chapter 2. The peddler's fortune, Meyer Guggenheim, arrived in America in 1847. A Swiss Jewish immigrant from a small village in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, a place where Jews had lived under heavy restrictions for generations, hemmed in on where they could live and whom they could marry. He came with no money and no English, looking for the one thing the old country had denied his family, which was room to rise. He started, as so many did, as a peddler, walking the coal towns of Pennsylvania, selling stove polish and lace and whatever else he could carry. He was sharp, relentless, and patient. Early on, he noticed that a stove polish he was buying to resell was making its maker rich, so he found out how to produce it himself and cut out the man above him. That was the instinct that built everything. He understood something most peddlers never grasped, which is that the real money is not in carrying the goods, but in making them, and then in controlling the whole chain from the ground to the shelf. The fortune itself began with a debt. In 1881, Meyer took a half-interest in 2 Colorado silver mines, near Leadville, in payment of money he was owed. By some accounts, he put in a little more to get them working. They turned out to be among the richest mines in the district, and the debt Meyer had reluctantly accepted made him a serious fortune. From silver he moved into smelting, the processing of the raw ore into metal, which is where the steadier and larger money sat. He built his own smelters, and to feed them cheaply he went where the rules were looser, building great works in Mexico under the old regime there. From smelting he moved toward control of the whole business, from the rock in the ground to the refined metal sold on the exchange. The decisive moment came in 1901. There was already a giant smelting trust, the American Smelting and Refining Company, and the Guggenheims, rather than join it on someone else's terms, fought their way into control of it. They folded their own mining and smelting operations into it in a deal worth more than $45 million in stock, and walked away holding the wheel of the largest metal operation in the country. Meyer's sons ran it. His second son, Daniel, became the dominant force, the brother who turned a large fortune into an enormous one. They pushed across the world, into Alaska, into Chile and Bolivia, even into the Congo, chasing copper and silver and lead wherever it could be dug. They were no longer a mining family. They were a global power in metal, with the reach of a small empire and the cohesion of a single household, 7 brothers and their father acting, for a crucial stretch, as one. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. By 1915, the Guggenheims controlled, by some estimates, as much as 75 to 80% of the world's silver, copper, and lead, a share large enough to move the prices of 3 metals on the open market. At its height, the family fortune was estimated at something like $250 to $300 million. The smelting company they controlled, worth roughly $500 million on its own, at a time when a working man might earn $500 in a year. They were, for a moment, one of the richest families on Earth. And they did what the very richest American families learned to do in that era. They began turning the money into things that would outlast them: foundations and museums and endowments, institutions built to carry the name forward long after the men who made the fortune were gone. Remember that, because it is the thing Peggy's branch never did, and the thing that will close this story. I want to sit with the scale of that for a second, because it is the necessary background to everything that follows. This was not comfortable wealth. This was dynastic, world-shaping wealth, the kind that builds museums and endows universities and puts family names on buildings for a century. And it is the wealth that Peggy Guggenheim, granddaughter of the peddler who started it, would spend her life standing just outside of. Meyer died in 1905, and the fortune, by then enormous, ran on through his 7 sons. They held together where most rich families fly apart, and for a generation they acted as a single hand on a single empire. 6 of them stayed in the business and grew rich beyond reckoning. One of them did not. The one who did not was Peggy's father, and his choice is where her story really begins. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. The easier path. Benjamin Guggenheim was the 5th of Meyer's 7 sons, born in Philadelphia in 1865. He was charming, handsome, and restless, fond of Paris and of women and of the pleasures that money makes easy, the son least suited to the grinding, unglamorous patience that had built the family business. The fortune had been made by men willing to spend decades on smelter margins and freight rates. Benjamin was not that kind of man. In the early years of the new century, around the time his brothers were consolidating their empire into the great smelting trust, Benjamin did something none of the others did. He took his share and began to step away. The accounts differ on exactly when he made the final break, but they agree on what it was. He went out on his own, into the manufacturing of machinery, and put much of his money into a company called the International Steam Pump Company. It was, by the family's standards, the easier path, the path of a man who wanted to be his own master, rather than one of 6 brothers sharing a fortune. It did not go well. The steam pump business struggled, and Benjamin's money went into it and did not come back out. He borrowed against his holdings, pledging large blocks of his stock as collateral for bank loans. While his brothers multiplied their wealth many times over, riding the metal empire to its peak, Benjamin slowly went the other way, a Guggenheim quietly sliding toward ruin, while the name blazed brighter than ever. By 1912, he was spending much of his time in Paris, living the life of a wealthy man even as the wealth drained away. traveling with a French mistress, a cabaret singer. In April of that year, he booked passage home to New York. The ship he chose was the brand new, supposedly unsinkable pride of the White Star Line. It was the Titanic. What happened in the early hours of the 15th of April 1912 comes down to us only through the accounts of the people who survived, so it must be held a little loosely. But the accounts agree on the shape of it. After the ship struck the iceberg, Benjamin and his valet were helped into lifebelts and went up to help women and children into the boats. Then, with the ship going down and no place for them in any boat, Benjamin and his valet, a young man named Victor Giglio, went back to their quarters and changed into full evening dress. The valet died with him. So did his chauffeur, who had also been traveling with him. By the account of one of the stewards, Benjamin said that they had put on their best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen. He left a message for his wife in New York, that if anything happened to him, she should be told he had done his best and done his duty. One survivor remembered him putting a flower in his buttonhole. He and his valet were last seen sitting in the grand staircase, and their bodies were never recovered. His mistress survived in a lifeboat. There is something I cannot quite get past in that image. Here was a man who had already lost the fortune, who had chosen the easier path and watched it fail, dressing in his finest clothes to die well, performing the part of the gentleman of leisure at the exact moment the leisure had run out. It was a beautiful death, and, underneath it, a ruined one, and it is the death that set the terms of his daughter's entire life. Because what Benjamin left Peggy was not the fortune the name implied. When his estate was settled, his affairs were found to be in something close to disarray, much of his stock pledged against bank loans, several holdings worthless. When his estate was finally appraised, the gross value came to around $3.5 million, but after the debts and the loans against his stock and the costs of settling it, what remained was far less, and much of what he had held was marked down or worthless. His widow received the largest share. What came down to each of his 3 daughters, held in trust until she turned 21, was a sum of around $450,000, throwing off an income of roughly $22,000 a year. It was a great deal of money by the measure of ordinary people. It was very little by the measure of a Guggenheim. And because the principal was locked in trust until she came of age, Peggy could not touch the bulk of it for years, which left her, all through her youth, a Guggenheim who had to be careful about money. She would spend her life inside that gap. Chapter 4. The Name Without the Money. It is worth being precise about what kind of poor Peggy Guggenheim was, because it was a very particular kind. She was not poor in any way an ordinary person would recognize. She had an income of around $22,000 a year from her father's trust, at a time when that was a comfortable living several times over. What she was poor by the standards of her own family, and that is a different and stranger condition. Her cousins were managing hundreds of millions. Her uncle Daniel had run an empire that set world prices. Her uncle Solomon was assembling an art collection of his own and would soon endow a foundation, in 1937, and commission a great spiraling museum in New York that still bears the family name and draws crowds every day. He did it the way the rich do these things, with a baroness to advise him, a grand plan, and a building meant to last forever. Her uncle Simon became a United States Senator from Colorado, and then put the family name on the most famous fellowships in the country, the grants that still, a century later, send thousands of scholars and artists and scientists out into the world to do their work. To this day, when a writer wins one, they say they have won a Guggenheim, and they are speaking of Peggy's uncle. The Guggenheims were not just rich, They were becoming permanent, the kind of family that turns money into institutions that outlast everyone alive. And there was the other side of her blood, too. Her mother, Florette, came from the Seligmans, a German Jewish banking family who had been established in America longer and who looked down on the mining Guggenheims as newcomers, as people who had dug their money out of the ground rather than earning it at a desk. So Peggy grew up inside a double snobbery. The Seligmans condescended to the Guggenheims as miners with dirt under their nails. The rich Guggenheims, in their turn, had little particular use for the daughter of the brother who had left, and failed, and drowned with his affairs in disarray. She belonged fully to neither side, and was claimed warmly by neither. By the standards of both families, she was a slightly awkward fact, a girl with a famous name and a thin trust. The gap between what people assumed about her and what was actually true ran very wide. One friend in Paris was convinced that Peggy was worth $70 million, a fortune that would be well over $1 billion today. The truth was, a few $100,000 in trust, and an income that was generous for a person and trivial for a dynasty. The legend of Guggenheim money preceded her into every room, and the legend was always richer than the woman. She had the name, which opened every door in Europe and America, and she did not have the money that everyone behind those doors assumed came with it. People extended her credit, social and otherwise, against a fortune she did not possess. It made her, in a way that mattered, an imposter in plain sight, a real Guggenheim who was not a rich one, moving through rooms that had badly miscounted her. She felt the snub of it her whole life, the sense of being the wrong Guggenheim, the one whose father had broken the chain. But here is the strange mercy buried inside the snub. I think this is the most important fact about her, more important than any painting or any lover, and it is easy to miss, because it sounds like a complaint about being insufficiently rich. It is not. It is the engine of everything she became. A woman with the full Guggenheim fortune would have had no reason to do anything difficult. She could have collected art the way her uncle did, slowly, expensively, with advisors and a building. Peggy could not afford to do it that way. By the standards of her family, she had been handed almost nothing, and being handed almost nothing turned out to be a kind of freedom. She came, in time, to say it plainly, that she no longer felt like a real Guggenheim. She was right, and being right about it set her loose. With the name, a modest income, and no real place at the family table, she did the one thing the rich Guggenheims never had to do. She went looking, in Europe, for a life that was actually her own. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. A Picture a Day. In 1921, in her early 20s, Peggy Guggenheim moved to Paris, and Paris in the 1920s was the one place on earth where her particular combination of name, money, and restlessness could turn into something. She married a writer named Lawrence Vail, a fixture of the Bohemian scene who was sometimes called the King of Bohemia, and through him and the people around him, she entered the avant-garde at its very center. She knew the painters and the poets and the troublemakers. She modeled for Man Ray. She helped fund Emma Goldman's memoirs. She moved among James Joyce and Constantin Brancusi and Juna Barnes. Near the end of the 1930s, she also began an affair with a then unknown Irish writer named Samuel Beckett, who told her, in his way, that the art worth caring about was the art of one's own time, the living thing, not the safe old masters. It was advice that pointed her exactly where she was about to go. For most of the next 2 decades, she was a wealthy bohemian, interesting and well-connected, but not yet the figure she would become. The thing that changed her was a death and an idea. In 1937, her mother died, leaving her a second trust of around $500,000. And for the first time, Peggy had a sum of money and no clear idea what to do with it. A friend suggested she open an art gallery, so she did. The gallery was in London, on Cork Street, and she called it Guggenheim Jeune, which means Guggenheim the Younger, a small private joke at the expense of her stodgier uncle and his grand operation back in New York. She opened it in 1938. She did not yet know a great deal about modern art, and she did the smartest thing a person in that position can do. She found people who did, above all the artist Marcel Duchamp, who sat her down and taught her, patiently, the difference between the various modern movements, between the abstract and the surreal, who was serious and who was not. Then the war changed everything, and Peggy did something that still seems half mad and half visionary. As Europe slid toward catastrophe, with the German army on the move, she decided that she would buy art, and buy it fast. She set herself a rule. She would buy one picture a day, armed with a list of the important modern artists, drawn up with the help of the critic Herbert Reed and revised by Duchamp. She went shopping in a Paris where the greatest art of the century was suddenly for sale at almost nothing, because the people who owned it were terrified and trying to flee. The stories from those months are extraordinary. She bought a Leger, by her account, on the very morning that Hitler invaded Norway. She went to see Brancusi again and again, partly, she admitted with great honesty, in the hope that an affair might bring down the price of the sculpture she wanted. When she finally carried away his great gleaming bird, she said the old sculptor had tears running down his face. She called on Picasso, who looked at this American woman come to buy and reportedly told her the lingerie department was upstairs. In about 6 months, she acquired dozens of works, the nucleus of one of the great collections of the century, for something in the region of $40,000. And then, with the Germans closing in on Paris, she needed somewhere to put it all. She asked the Louvre, the greatest museum in France, whether it would shelter her collection along with its own treasures. The Louvre considered the paintings she had gathered, the Leger and Kandinsky's and Klee's and the Brancusi, and decided, in her own words, that the collection was not worth the trouble of saving. They were too modern, too strange, not real art in the eyes of the institution. I want to leave that judgment sitting where it is for a moment, because it is one of the great misjudgments in the history of taste. The same works the Louvre would not bother to hide in 1940 are estimated today to be worth well over $1 billion. The single largest painting she would soon commission has reportedly been valued at something like $140 million on its own. The most important museum in France looked at the future of art and saw nothing worth abasement, so she would have to save it herself. Everything she had bought in those frantic months would have to be carried out of a falling Europe by hand, and she would carry it across the ocean to a city already full of Guggenheims who had no idea what she had. Chapter 6. The Respectable Guggenheim. While Peggy was buying pictures in a panic in Paris, another Guggenheim was collecting modern art the way the family was supposed to do everything, slowly, expensively, and with a great deal of help. Her uncle Solomon, one of the brothers who had stayed in the business and grown enormously rich, had discovered abstract painting late in life, and he had thrown the full weight of the fortune behind it. He did not do it alone. His guide was a German artist and aristocrat, the Baroness Hilla von Rebe, who had strong and narrow ideas about what counted as real modern art. She believed in what she called non-objective painting, pure abstraction with no reference to the visible world, the spiritual end of modern art, and she steered Solomon away from almost everything else. She had her own favorites she pushed him to buy heavily, one painter in particular with whom she was personally involved, and she had little patience for the messier, more figurative, more disreputable currents that Peggy would end up championing. Solomon's collection was, in a sense, the taste of one strong-willed baroness, backed by one of the largest fortunes in America. Together they assembled a collection and, in 1939, opened a museum to house it, which they called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. A few years later, they commissioned the architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, to design a permanent home, the Great White Spiral on Fifth Avenue, that still carries the Guggenheim name. Wright took the commission in the early 1940s, but the building would not open until 1959, 6 months after his own death. It was the respectable, monumental, slow way of doing things, the way a great fortune builds a temple to itself. There is a useful contrast buried here between two ways of being rich and serious about art. One way is the institutional way, the way of the foundation and the advisor and the monument, where the money does the deciding and the taste is delegated to an expert and the goal is permanence. The other way is the personal way, where one set of eyes looks at one painting and decides, fast, with its own money on the line. Solomon embodied the first. Peggy was about to embody the second. So there were, by the late 1930s, two Guggenheims chasing the modern in art from opposite ends of the same world. And they did not chase it together. The uncle had the money, the baroness, the building, and the plan. The niece had a few $100,000, an eye she was still training, and a willingness to back things nobody respectable would touch. She even named her London gallery Guggenheim Jeune, the younger Guggenheim, as a small jab at the grand operation her uncle was running back home. The two of them brushed against each other exactly once, in a way that mattered, and it tells you everything. When Peggy visited the painter Vasily Kandinsky, he asked her to use her family connection to persuade Solomon to buy his work again. Peggy raised it with Rebay, who controlled what Solomon bought. Rebay's answer, by the accounts that survive, was a cold one. She made it clear that they would never buy a painting through Peggy's gallery, and that she did not regard Peggy's enterprise as a serious one at all. There was even an edge of warning in it, a sense that Peggy should not presume to involve herself in the real Guggenheim's affairs. The poor relation had offered to help, and had been told, in effect, to stay out of the way of the real Guggenheims. It is worth remembering that Kandinsky, the painter caught in the middle, is now considered one of the towering figures of modern art. Peggy was willing to handle him. The respectable Guggenheim operation, guided by its baroness, treated the request as an intrusion. I want to pause on that refusal, because it is the hinge of the whole story. In 1939, if you had asked anyone in the art world which Guggenheim mattered, the answer would have been Solomon, without hesitation. He had the museum, the baroness, the millions, the architect. Peggy had a small gallery losing money in London and a reputation as a rich woman playing at art. The judgment of the moment was unanimous, and the judgment of the moment was wrong. Because the uncle, for all his money, was collecting through someone else's narrow taste, locked onto a single kind of abstraction. Peggy was collecting through her own eye, and her eye was open to everything that was actually happening. The Cubists and the Surrealists, and, soon, something brand new that had not even been named yet. The uncle had the building, the niece had the better eye. History has been kind to exactly one of them, and the 1930s would have bet on the wrong one. The temple on Fifth Avenue is a landmark, and a fine one, but the taste it was built around, that single narrow idea of pure abstraction, looks today like one current among many. The things Peggy backed, the Surrealists and then the Americans, became the main river of 20th century art. She was about to prove it, not in a temple on Fifth Avenue, but in a single strange room a few blocks away. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you, and it stays free. Chapter 7. Art of this century. Getting out of Europe was its own ordeal. As France fell and the Germans closed in, Peggy arranged to ship her collection home disguised as ordinary household goods, and she arranged to get people out too. She helped fund the rescue work that smuggled artists and intellectuals out of occupied France, and she personally helped the German painter Max Ernst, who was in real danger, as both a German national and a maker of the kind of art the Nazis despised, escaped to America. She also gave money to the rescue committee run by the American Varian Fry, whose work in Marseille smuggled artists and writers marked for death out of Vichy France. In the summer of 1941, she flew out through Lisbon with a small group that included Ernst, her former husband Laurence Vail, the writer Kay Boyle, and the founder of Surrealism himself, André Breton. She was, in effect, helping to carry European modernism out of the fire and across the Atlantic, in crates and in person both. That December, in New York, she married Ernst. Then she opened the room that changed American art. It was a gallery called Art of This Century on West 57th Street in Manhattan, and it opened in October of 1942. She hired an Austrian architect named Friedrich Kiesler and told him to do something nobody had seen, and he did. The walls curved. Paintings came off the walls on arms, floating in space without frames. The lighting shifted on and off. It looked less like a gallery than like the inside of someone's imagination, and it announced, before a single painting was studied, that the old rules were suspended here. Over the next 5 years, the gallery would mount more than 50 exhibitions and show more than 100 artists. It sat in the same Midtown district as the established museums, and their directors came to see what she was doing. Peggy described her gallery as a research laboratory for new ideas, a place meant to serve the future rather than to record the past, which was a direct shot at the museum establishment a few blocks away. What happened on those curved walls was the birth of something. With most of the established European artists scattered by the war, and most of the young American men drafted into it, the gallery became the place where a new and entirely American kind of painting first found room to breathe. The painter Lee Krasner said later that art of this century was where it all started to happen. The first place the new American art could actually be seen. The center of gravity of the art world was beginning to shift across the ocean, from Paris to New York, and for a few crucial years, it shifted through Peggy's gallery. And then there was Pollock. Jackson Pollock was working as a carpenter and handyman, painting in obscurity, troubled and drinking, when Peggy was persuaded to look at his work. She did more than look. On the advice of people whose eyes she trusted, including Mondrian, who saw at once that this rough unknown was doing something genuinely new, she committed to him. She gave him a contract, a monthly stipend, to free him from odd jobs and let him paint full-time. And she gave him show after show, when almost no one else in New York would hang him at all. She commissioned an enormous painting for the entrance hall of her townhouse, a canvas some 20 feet long, the work now simply called mural. There is a famous legend that Pollock painted the whole thing in a single night before a party. The careful study of the canvas says otherwise, that it was built up over weeks in layers, though the first sweep of it may have gone down very fast. Either way, it was a turning point, the moment Pollock found the scale and the open freedom that would soon make him the most famous painter in America. The huge canvas, all motion and rhythm and refusal of any single image, pointed straight at the drip paintings still to come. She had not just bought a picture, she had funded a breakthrough and given it a wall the size it needed. I think it is worth saying plainly what she did here, because the legend tends to swallow it. A woman with a thin trust fund and no formal training, dismissed by her own family's art establishment as an amateur, identified the most important American painter of the century while he was an unknown drunk, and she paid him to become himself. The contract started at $150 a month and was later raised to $300, real money pulled from a not especially large income, spent on an unknown. She gave him 4 solo shows in 4 years. She would later call her support of Pollock the most important achievement of her life, more important than any painting she owned, and she was right to. She had bet on the future of art, twice, in 2 cities, and won both times. But the men she backed and the men she married would take their own kind of payment. and the bill for that came due in private, where the ledgers never reached. Chapter 8. My Own, or Other People's. This is the part the title promises, the scandalous part, the men and the appetite and the famous boast. And it needs to be told carefully, because the legend and the truth are not the same thing, and the legend was built partly by Peggy herself to keep the truth at a distance. The legend, which Peggy herself helped build, is of a woman of insatiable appetite who slept with 1,000 men. The number comes from Peggy. She enjoyed the shock of it, she scoped it loosely to her European years, and she repeated it, knowing exactly what it would do to the people who heard it. Her biographers have been trying to qualify it ever since, because the round, shocking 1,000 does not survive contact with an actual accounting of her life. One careful biographer puts the real figure at something over 400 and warns that the counts should not be taken literally at all. Peggy herself, asked once how many husbands she had had, is supposed to have replied that it depended whether you meant her own or other people's. She had, in the legal sense, exactly 2 of her own, Lawrence Vail and Max Ernst. The 1,000 was a kind of armor, a story she told so that the world would see a scandalous adventuress rather than a woman who had been hurt a great deal. What the breezy legend leaves out is how many of these men treated her. Her first husband, Lawrence Vail, was by her own account violent. She described him holding her underwater in the bath, grinding jam into her hair, throwing her belongings out of windows. A later companion, by her own account, made her stand naked at an open window in the cold and threw whiskey in her eyes. These are not the anecdotes of a libertine enjoying herself. They are, in her own telling, the experiences of a woman who kept choosing men who hurt her, and who wrote it all down later with a flatness that is harder to read than any complaint would be. When she published her memoir, with its frank accounts of the affairs and the marriages, the story went, one that Peggy herself enjoyed repeating, that her respectable uncles were so alarmed by the damage to the family name that they tried to buy up every copy they could find. How much truth was in it has never been established. A newspaper sneered that the book should have been titled Out of Her Head rather than Out of Her Century. The family that would one day live off her collection wanted, at the time, mainly to make her quiet. Even the marriage that should have been a meeting of equals was, on his side, a transaction. Max Ernst married her, by most accounts including her own, largely because she was his way out of Europe and his shelter once he arrived. He never warmed to her in the way she wanted. By her account, he never even addressed her with the intimate, affectionate form of the word you that the language he came from reserved for love. He left her, after a few years, for a younger painter named Dorothea Tanning. The woman who had saved his life and funded his American career was, to him, a door he walked through and closed behind him. And then there was Pollock, the great success, who curdled in a different way. As his fame began to climb, helped enormously by the start she had given him, Peggy came to feel she had been used and undervalued, that she had made him and been left with little for it. She felt cheated enough that she eventually took legal action over the matter of his work. And yet she never stopped calling him her greatest achievement, more important to her than any single painting she owned. Both things were true at once, the pride and the grievance, which is how it usually goes with the people we make and then watch outgrow us. She had given him the start, and the start had made him, and being made does not always leave a person grateful to the maker. I have spent a long time with this chapter of her life, and what stays with me is not the number, whatever it was. It is the loneliness underneath the legend. She built a reputation as a woman who consumed men, and the record underneath that reputation is mostly a record of men consuming her, taking the money, the rescue, the start, the shelter, and giving back cruelty or indifference. The scandal was the mask. She was, in the cruel old phrase, a poor little rich girl, except that she was never really rich, and the poverty that mattered was not financial at all. The story behind the legend is sadder and quieter, and much less fun than the title promises. And it is the truer story. When the marriages had failed and the New York moment had passed, she took the one thing in her life that had never betrayed her, the collection, and she went looking for somewhere to be left alone with it. If you have made it this deep into the story, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 9. The Palazzo. The turning point was Venice. In 1948, the Venice Biennale, the great international art exhibition that had gone dark during the war, invited Peggy to show her collection. She was given a pavilion, designed by a young Italian architect named Carlo Scarpa, and she filled it with work Europe had largely never seen, the Americans above all. Her presence helped bring the Biennale itself back to life after the long silence of the war. For many Europeans, it was the first time they laid eyes on a Pollock, a Rothko, a Gorky, the new American painting that would dominate the next 30 years. The poor relation of the Guggenheims arrived in Europe not as an heiress but as the woman who had the future of art in her crates, and the continent took notice. The same collection the Louvre had refused to hide a few years earlier was now the most talked about thing at the most important art exhibition in the world. The Biennale invitation did more than show her collection. It revived the event itself, and it told her where she belonged. Venice was a city of faded grandeur and serious beauty that asked nothing of her family and cared nothing for the Seligman snobberies of New York. She decided to stay. The next year, in 1949, she bought the unfinished palace on the Grand Canal, the low white Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, reportedly for $60,000, a fraction of what such a building would seem to be worth, partly because it had never been finished, and partly because post-war Venice was not a seller's market. She moved her collection into it, and she moved herself in for good. She would live there for the rest of her life, 3 decades, becoming as much a fixture of Venice as the bridges and the boats. She opened the palace to the public, starting in the early 1950s. For a few afternoons a week, anyone could come in and walk through one of the great private collections of modern art in the world, hung in the rooms where its owner actually lived, with the owner herself sometimes drifting through in dark glasses. There was nothing else quite like it anywhere. A living collection in a living house, neither fully a museum nor fully a home. People who visited in those years remembered the strangeness of it. The great paintings casually present in the rooms of an eccentric old American woman, the Pollocks near the breakfast things, the Picassos down the hall from the dogs. She became an institution by simply being herself in public. In the early 1960s, the city made her an honorary citizen, a rare honor, recognition from a place that knew exactly what it had in her, even when her own family did not. She belonged to Venice in a way she had never quite belonged to New York or to the Guggenheims. She drifted through Venice in her own gondola, one of the last private gondolas on the canals, in her enormous winged sunglasses, with her dogs beside her, a living piece of the city's scenery. Tourists pointed, artists made pilgrimages to her door. She had become, without ever holding the family fortune, the most famous Guggenheim in the world, the one the name would come to mean first in most minds, which is a sentence her uncles would have found impossible to believe. The dogs deserve their place in the story, because they were not a joke to her, whatever the legend makes of them. She kept a line of small dogs, as many as 14 at a time. A little dynasty of them descended one from another, and she loved them with an uncomplicated devotion she had rarely found in people. They slept on her bed. They traveled with her. They were spoiled and adored and given the trust she could not safely give to people. When they died, she buried them in the garden, one after another across the years, and she gave them a single plaque that called them her beloved babies and listed their names like a small family tree. A woman who had been let down by nearly every human she trusted built her steadiest family out of animals, and I find it hard to mock her for it. There is a temptation to see these years as a decline, the great patron shrinking into an eccentric old woman with too many dogs and a dirty joke of a statue on her terrace. I think that reading is wrong. She had done her great work. She had found the artists, made the market, moved the center of the art world across an ocean, and then she had carried the proof of it to the most beautiful city on earth and put it on her own walls. The eccentric in the gondola was not a faded patron. She was a woman living inside her own finished achievement. The one question left was what would happen to all of it when she was gone. The collection she had assembled for the price of a nice house, and that was now worth more than she could have imagined. And the answer to that question would complete the irony her whole life had been quietly building toward. Chapter 10. Here lie my beloved babies. In 1969, near the end of her life, Peggy lent her collection to her uncle's museum in New York, the great Frank Lloyd Wright Spiral, for an exhibition. She went to see it hanging there, the pictures she had chosen on almost no money, displayed in the temple the rich branch of the family had built. She remarked that her uncle Solomon, who had never taken her seriously as a collector, would probably be turning in his grave to see her work hanging on his walls. There was satisfaction in the line, and also something sadder under it, the old ache of a recognition that came too late to be enjoyed by the person whose opinion she had actually wanted. Then she made the decision that closed the circle. She gave it all to him, or rather to his foundation. She had no faith that her own small foundation could protect the collection after her death, and the well-run institution, with the resources to keep it together forever, was the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation, the respectable branch, the people who had dismissed her. So she gave them the palace in 1970, and then the collection itself by a deed of gift in 1976, on the condition that she could live in the palace and keep the collection around her until she died. She called the bequest, with her usual dryness, rather a joke, given that she had never been on good terms with her uncle. But she made it anyway, because the work mattered more to her than the grudge. She died in 1979, after a stroke, at the age of 81. Her ashes were placed in the corner of the garden, beside the graves of the dogs, under the plaque with their names. The foundation took over. In the spring after her death, the Peggy Guggenheim collection opened to the public year-round, and it has run that way ever since. In the decades since, her descendants have gone to court more than once against the foundation, arguing that her wishes were being bent, that the collection was being diluted by other donors' works hung among hers, that her grave had been crowded by later sculpture. The foundation has largely prevailed, on the strength of the deed she signed. Even in death, she remained what she had been in life, a Guggenheim slightly at odds with the institutional Guggenheims, the family never quite at peace with itself. Now step back from the chronology for a moment, because the shape of the thing only appears when you stop following it year by year. It would be easy to tell this as a story of sad irony, of a woman dismissed in life and vindicated only in death, her enemies winning at last by putting their name over her collection. It would be easy, and I do not think it is right. The foundation did not defeat her. It absorbed her, which is a different thing. The name on the door was always going to be Guggenheim. The only question was which Guggenheim the name would come to mean, and the answer, in Venice, is her. What strikes me, after all of it, is that the exclusion was never the wound in this story. It was the engine. A richer Peggy, a Peggy fully inside the family fortune, would have collected safely, through advisors, in some approved direction, and we would not be talking about her. The thin trust, the failed father, the family that looked past her, the establishment that called her an amateur. All of it pushed her outside the rooms where things were done properly, and outside those rooms was the only place the real work could be done. She was free precisely because she did not count. What survived is almost everything that mattered. The collection survived, intact, in the city she chose. The judgment survived. The eye that saw Pollock in a drunk carpenter. Her name survived on the palace, which draws close to 400,000 people a year, the most visited place in Venice after the Doge's palace. What did not survive was the verdict of her own time, the family's certainty that she was the lesser Guggenheim, the art world's certainty that her uncle was the one who mattered. The money built the spiral on Fifth Avenue. The eye, working almost without money, built the thing in Venice that people now cross the world to see. Go back, one last time, to the terrace on the Grand Canal, the low white palace that was never finished. The bronze horseman facing the water, arms flung wide, complete in every detail the sculptor and the owner intended. The garden behind, where the dogs are buried and where she is buried with them. The horseman still faces the water. The sunglasses and the gondola are gone, but the line of visitors comes every day now, down the canal and through the rooms she lived in, past the paintings she carried out of a burning Europe by hand. By the stories she liked to tell, they had once tried to buy up every copy of her book. They own the collection now instead, and the name over the door is Guggenheim, which is the one thing she always had, and the one thing, in the end, that turned out to be entirely hers. This is what this channel is for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.